I just took step one a month ago, almost exactly 1 year after starting medical school, and in this video I'll explain to you exactly why I think most medical students have their approach to studying for step one completely wrong. This video is going to be most pertinent to you, especially if you're a current medical student studying for step one, or if you're an undergrad or somebody applying to medical school right now interested in learning about step one. If you want the fastest path to what in my opinion is the best way to take step one early and build yourself up for success in your future step two score, in this video you'll leave with a blueprint and my checklist on exactly what I think are the best ways to start studying for it now. My name is Pierce and I'm an M2 student at a US medical school, and like I just said, I took step one a month ago and got the pass. So in this video, I'm going to explain what's very fresh for me and what I think are the best strategies to do and the best things to avoid when studying for step one. I've talked to a ton of mentors along the way, from people that are upperclassmen of mine to other people in my class, to see what has worked for them along the way, but also what you should avoid and definitely not do. As a general disclaimer before we get started, I am not in any way affiliated with the MBME or any other test prep company, so I'm not trying to sell you anything with this video. Just simply what worked for me. Of course, always talk to your own academic advisor if you need to before making any big changes to your plans. And with that out of the way, let's dive into part one, which is the overall perspective for step one, which I call the basics. Something I cannot emphasize enough is that just because step one is now pass fail doesn't mean you shouldn't treat it as if it weren't on a curve, because it's going to lay the foundation for everything that you do. Now, it is up to you on whether or not you want to build your foundation out of something like sand or stone. I know there are a few medical schools out there that take step one and step two essentially at the same time, and this is still going to be useful for you, but primarily for those students that take step one and then later have a time period to take step two. And I want to take a little detour here to give you something that is literally the foundation for everything that I'm going to talk about in this video. And I'm going to start with defining a term that both of us need to be on the same page with for the rest of the video, and that is academic integrity. And no, I'm not talking about cheating. This is a skill, and before I go ahead and define it and tell you all about it, if it's something that you're unfamiliar with or haven't heard talked about very much, it doesn't mean that you aren't a person of integrity. In fact, being a person of integrity and having academic integrity are two separate things. For the most part, I think a lot of students don't have academic integrity, but it is definitely a skill, like I said, that can be improved, and it exists on a spectrum, so you can always improve it. And after I realized what it was, it made things so much more clear and click in place for me on why high-performing students are the way they are. So we all know that at baseline, different types of people have different types of intelligence, and some people are better at picking up different types of skills than others. So why is it that when we take two students that generally have the same level of intelligence toward a specific skill, in this case medical school learning, and let's exclude all of the other variables and say that they're equal between those two students? Let's say they both have the same things going on outside of medical school, they have the same family obligations, and for academics they both do the same, let's say 1,000 Anki flashcards every single day for content. Why is it that one of them may still perform better on exams? And again, let's not say that it's because of any outside background knowledge that they knew before coming into medical school. This is purely based on what they just learned. And the best explanation that I can offer for this is my definition of academic integrity, and I want to make sure I read it very clearly, so I'm going to read it off of my script here. And that definition is two-pronged. So it's number one, how accurately one can self-assess their depth of knowledge, and number two, how committed they are to improving it through active learning. So this is very similar to character, but in an academic sense, it's something that you can't see about a person, but what they do when other people aren't looking. So if I were to stand behind these two students and they were both doing their 1,000 flashcards that they were going to do each day, I would not be able to see the person that had academic integrity with my own eyes, although I can tell you how you would know. And again, the person with academic integrity might spend a little bit more time per card, but when this comes to review cards, this probably wouldn't be the case. But I'm going to explain this with some examples in terms of the definition. So the student of the two with a higher level of academic integrity would be able to get further down the why chain. And you might be asking, well, what is the why chain? So if I were to introduce a new piece of information to these two students and I were to ask them why whenever they answer the back of the flashcard, there would be a level of deeper knowledge that would be underlying each of those flashcards that they answered, eventually getting down to the basic sciences, and the more complex questions about more complex care would have more whys before they got down to the fundamental basic sciences. And this is really getting to who understands the core principles of what they're learning better and can tie their information better together. So the student with the higher level of academic integrity actually has a baseline level of discomfort when they answer a flashcard and they realize that on the back of the card they actually don't know the answer as to why something is. They feel like they're just verbatim memorizing it, and that bothers them. And that number one, going back to the definition, has to do with their level of self-assessment, which is that they don't actually know it. But number two, and most importantly, they're committed to understanding a deeper level of knowledge. So they might go online or go into another resource and really look it up and spend time until they finally feel comfortable with that piece of information. So a second example of the two about the student with a higher level of academic integrity is they're not going to be just purely using memorization or pattern recognition when they get to the back of a flashcard. So we all know those long flashcards that are just way too revealing on the answer, because really, even though the answer is something very specific, there are like 8 different specific things in the question sim that any one of those 8 things could point you to the answer. So when they answer that card, it can almost feel like cheating to this person, because they're going to feel like, well, I just fixated on the point that I was most comfortable with and then ignored the other 7. That's why, in my opinion, some of the best flashcards are actually the shortest, paradoxically, because they leave the least amount of information for you to use as context clues, and you just have to quickly and deeply get to the basic point of what the card is trying to get to. And then on the counter, you have the student that blows through all 1,000 cards and gets to the end of it, and then you try to have a conversation conversation with them and they can't actually explain anything they just learned, because when they see it, they're going to know the answer, although that's not how things actually present themselves in real life in a hospital setting, that's for sure. And then also on these standardized exams like step 1. So maybe the student that just passively goes through these cards and primarily uses memorization and pattern recognition can actually self-assess the fact that they do this, but they're still lacking that second component of the academic integrity, which is the commitment to actually improving that and then rectifying the change by integrating it more deeply. And then another example out of the two students when comparing academic integrity is that the student with the higher level of academic integrity is not going to convince themselves that they know things that they don't. And this gets at the Dunning-Kruger effect, which if you're not familiar with it, it essentially just points to the fact that the more information that you actually gather, the more you realize that you don't know. Students that can move further down the Y chain will actually get to the bottom of this much faster, and then we'll realize that the fundamental things that we don't know as a society are the things that we don't know for a reason, but can actually point out the fact that they don't know this. Whereas on the other hand, the student that doesn't have a high level of academic integrity, especially the ones that can't self-assess well, will convince themselves that they do know everything that needs to be known, and it's because they do know the things that are right in front of their eyes, but they don't know the questions that lie underneath, and those are much more prominent than the actual questions they're answering. So in my final comparison here between these two students, let's look at the fundamental entire web of knowledge that these two students have gained over step 1 studying over this entire period as a web. So the student with the higher level of academic integrity, when they're adding in a new piece of information into this web, they're going to put it into the center of this web, or at least somewhere where they can actually ground that piece of information to a bunch of other points. So if you were to look at each point of information that somebody knows as a point in the web where different lines intersect, the person with the higher level of academic integrity is going to have many more points of intersection that combine into this node, whereas the person with less academic integrity is just going to add in a new piece of information as a single string off the side of the web, and then is only going to know that piece of information in one context, whereas the student that understands it more deeply is going to have different angles of context that they can get to that node with. So if you were a little bug that was crawling along this web highway and you were trying to get to that point of information or trying to recall it, you would only be able to get to the memorized piece of information via one lane, and that's if you saw it in a different perspective, which you will in the hospital setting or on an exam like step 1, whereas you could get to the other piece of information much more quickly and from many more angles. So why is this important? And this is important because you naturally will forget things over time, aka those lanes and those intersections in the webs will naturally decay over time. But if you were to integrate that piece of knowledge into a bigger intersection in the web and combine it with many other facts, even though one of those lanes that gets you to that point you're trying to get to may decay over time with your natural forgetting curve, you can still get to it much more easily. This is what people are referring to when they're saying that somebody misses the bigger picture. They haven't tied it into everything else. And really, from all my experience that I've had really throughout undergrad and now definitely in medical school, the students that employ this strategy more often are the ones that perform higher really across the academic scale, but especially on these standardized exams. These are the students that you can actually talk to and have full-on conversations about new subjects that you just learned. So even though these two students may have done the same level of input, aka 1,000 cards every day, the levels of output are going to be drastically different because of these two strategies. So now we can go ahead and move on to part 2, which is really the meat and bones of what this video is about, which is what to optimize for step 1. Now, to take a step back, in the limit, in my opinion, what you're really optimizing for with step 1 is actually step 2. So let me explain. So I like to look at step 1 as the not only the first step, which you're thinking, duh, obviously you can't take your second step without taking your first step, but also the foundation of what the second step is going to be building on in the first place. So from the time that I've already taken to go ahead and look at content for step 2 studying, I can tell you that I'm keeping over 3/4, over 75% of the cards or information that I've studied for step 1, and I'm directly going to keep it in my study rotation so that I can use it on step 2. So again, thinking from a larger perspective, we're obviously studying the human body. There's not that much that's going to be changed. There's not two direct one step and second step things that come with the human body. It's all going to be essentially based in the same logical core components that is the practice of medicine. Obviously, step 1 is going to have things that aren't included on step 2 if you were to look at it in terms of a Venn diagram, and those are going to be the more molecular protein biochemistry components. And step 2 is of course going to have things that you need step 1 to have built on, which are how are we going to clinically assess this person, and what are the best steps in management of this pathology, and what are maybe some of the deeper components of the pathology. Outside of that though, these really have a ton of overlap. So for that reason, step 1 and step 2, as I mentioned earlier, are inextricably tied together, essentially the same thing, just in different formats and with slightly different content. One of them just happens to be preliminary and a pass-fail basis, and then the second one just happens to be on a distribution, and you're going to be applying to residencies with that score. So it's going to be slightly higher stakes. Actually, it's going to be much higher stakes, and it's going to be a higher performance that you need to have on it. So I want to share an analogy that I think does a really good job of explaining what I'm trying to depict here. And this is with the fundamental understanding that step 2 is again what we're going to be applying to residencies with. It's what we're going to be showing on our application, and it has higher stakes than step 1, given that both of these have so much similarities and we need to choose what to optimize for. So if we think of a student's potential step 2 score as the height of a tower, tower that they're going to be building for the first 3 years of their medical school journey before they take step 2, then step 1 would be the foundation for what that height of the tower is that they can get to. Obviously, the higher your tower, the higher your score, the lower your tower, the lower your score, and we could even say that the height that you get to is the exact score that you're going to be able to get. Now, let's also assume that because all of these towers that students are building need to go so high, that they are limited by how strong their foundation is at the bottom. In essence, there's a cap on how high you can get your score to go based on the sturdiness of your foundation that you build with step 1. In the extreme, with the worst foundation, which is building a tower on sand, you essentially are guaranteed the lowest score because no structure, aka no step 2 score, will be able to stand because you never built a foundation in the first place. Again, in the opposite extreme, if you build the strongest foundation possible, you have unlocked the potential to achieve the maximum step 2 score, which I think is like a 300, but this is all not important. The key point is that if you build the strongest foundation, you have unlocked the potential to achieve the highest score. Now, you might be asking, okay, why would I not just do that? And I'll tell you why. Let's introduce the time component, which is that you only have, give or take, 3 years of medical school before you take your step 2 exam. Without the time component, obviously you're thinking, I want to build the highest tower possible. I want to achieve the most success. So let me spend the maximum amount of time I can spend on building my step 1 foundational knowledge to make it so rock solid that I unlock the highest potential possible. And I'm going to keep repeating the same subjects over and over again. I'm going to drill them in until I know everything fluidly for step 1 that I could possibly know, to the point where you're essentially living and breathing the content. Now, with the time component introduced, what you're actually trying to do is optimize for how do I get the most returns on the least input in the first year or 2 years, whatever the time component is, before you take step 1, so that you can build the strongest necessary foundation in order to build the highest step 2 score without spending all of your time doing that, so that you can be confident and quick in how you take your step 1, so that you can go ahead and move on to what the more important ranked exam is. In my argument, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail in just a second, is that if you use the leverage of academic integrity to go ahead and implement that information as solidly and quickly as possible, this is actually how you optimize that time. And to go ahead and address the thoughts in your head or the comments that may inevitably happen, I know this isn't the perfect analogy because some of you may be saying in your step 1 studying time, you can still use that time to build some of your foundation. And in your step 1 studying time, you can go ahead and build some of your clinical acumen and your decision-making skills. And yes, that's true. But I think this drives home the key message of the learning component, maybe not necessarily the practice exams or specific test taking strategies. This is for picking up that content and being comfortable enough with it, which is the majority of your exam taking preparation. The second part of this, which I just alluded to, is streamlining the approach to the most solid foundation that you can build and do it in a way that is fast and makes sense. And I'll go ahead and give you my live and die by approach. A key value that's actually drilled in multiple domains, but the most pertinent example that comes to mind is the Navy SEAL training. If you haven't seen the Buds Class 234 documentary, I would definitely recommend you watch it, but it's to do something right the first time. At face value, it seems incredibly inefficient to spend something like twice the amount of time that a normal student would spend on unlocking a new flashcard and writing things in the description that will help you remember why the answer is what it is, explain again to the bottom of the Y chain as far as you can, to drag pictures onto it, to even annotate your own notes onto those pictures, to have conversations with AI about it. Whatever it takes for you to actually understand why is this card important and how might it show up on exam, it could take much more time. But when you don't take the time to integrate a new piece of knowledge the first time, aka going back to the web of knowledge example, you just attach it as a single node on the outside of the web of knowledge, or you just look at the card and take it as face value, or you just memorize the pattern, memorize the card, what the words say, get the vibe of it, all of those things. There are simply two ways that this is going to turn out for you, and this is based, trust me, on personal experience. The first and most obvious way that this is going to go is that when you get a new question or a new way of framing this subject that you just memorized in an unfamiliar domain, which is likely either going to be on a practice exam or the actual step 1 itself, you're simply not going to know how to approach it and you're going to miss the question, which is going to lead to a lower score. The second, and in my opinion, the more common way that this went for me when I was studying, was that whenever you keep seeing this card over and over, again, number one, it's going to be frustrating when you see that card, but what you're going to slowly start doing is that instead of having it attached to your web of knowledge in only one node, again, only knowing it in one way, each time you get the card wrong and redo it, you're going to try to slowly attach one more node to it and you're going to keep integrating it into your web. Whereas if you had to just integrated it the first time, it would have taken you twice the amount of time. Now you're going to at least have to see the card 3 times and get it wrong and slowly build those integrations in, which actually, even though it seemed less efficient to add the card in the right way the first time, takes way more time and you lose all of that added value, which we just established is incredibly important when you're trying to get step 1 out of the way with and build a solid foundation with it so that you can take step 2. So if those weren't enough reasons, what I'm going to go ahead and do now, going back to if you did it right the first time, let's now apply the 8th wonder of the world, which is compounding returns, and illustrate just exactly why it is so much more important that you did it right the first time. So if you spent the time up front and you went ahead and made annotations or again uploaded pictures, annotated them, or if you're actually reading out of a textbook, you write notes out to the side of it, that actually is going to continue existing every single time you see the card again. It's not going to be a one and done thing unless you were to just take notes in a textbook and throw them off to the side, which I'm not talking about doing. I'm talking about consistently reviewing the same personally edited, personally annotated with your own fingerprint on them notes of your flashcards that you see every single time. That is going to yield you compounding returns because it's going to further solidify all of those nodes at one time instead of one single node each time that you do a card. Another thing is that the earlier you deeply understand a card, now every single time you go ahead and review that card, you're getting better and better at it. Whereas on the alternative, you're not just staying neutral with a card, you're getting it wrong and you're having to slowly add in more and more nodes. So now there's opportunity cost associated with not getting the card right the first time, and the other version of yourself that learned it right the first time is getting much more ahead of you much quicker, which again, the time component. The next thing is that if you do it right the first time and you go ahead and start adding in more new cards in the future, now your web of, again, step one only med school relevant knowledge that you're building has more nodes that you can then attach other points of information to. It'll become easier with your more interconnected web to find specific places to insert these new pieces of knowledge, and that is the definition of learning faster. Now, if you finish learning all the step one content that's necessary to build the most solid foundation to quickly and confidently take the test, you get compounding returns associated with the fact that you took it earlier. So now when you begin studying for step two, you can begin earlier than other people. Not only that, it removes the stress of studying, which oftentimes is what blocks people from studying more efficiently in the first place, because they're less worried about the amount of time and the amount of cramming that's required for step two, which is the exam that matters in the first place. So if having better learning materials, understanding a deeper knowledge, and moving through checkpoints faster isn't a good enough argument for what I'm trying to explain about step one optimization, I don't know what is. So there is no mistake from my previous points that I just gave that I have not already done myself and learned the hard way. I'm also always trying to improve in these areas and still have a long way to go, so by no means do I feel like I'm an expert. So my overarching personal strategy was to go ahead and have an end goal in mind so that I could go back and think about what the things I would need to be doing to prepare for that was. So in my school, there's a dedicated step one study block in which students don't have to attend classes and can just purely study for step one. Now, this starts from about October and goes until January, a little bit over a year after starting school. And in my case, I wanted to take step one as early in that block of time, aka at the beginning of October, as I could, so that I could enjoy the rest of the months to do either what I wanted to do extracurricular activities, to record these videos for you guys, or to go ahead and start studying for step two. So in order to do this, I had to go ahead and decide what I would wait or what I would prioritize, which in this case was studying for the board exam, which actually happened to be in place of studying for lecture content in our weekly exams that we had every Friday in class. So this is actually way easier said than done, because in my medical school, at least, we have exams every single Friday on a week's worth of lectures, usually about 10 to 13 lectures of what professors have talked about in our class. That is up to the medical school's discretion on what they feel like will prepare students best for step one, which is oftentimes not exactly in line with what actually prepares you best for the board exam. So instead of attending every single lecture and going to every professor's classroom session and doing all of their associated work, what this actually looked like doing was sacrificing some of that so that I could do my own research and figure out the work that I needed to be doing so that I could check all of the boxes on what I would need to be doing to be prepared to take step one as quickly and confidently as possible. So I actually went with a strategy that involved overlapping as closely as I could those third-party material resources and mapping them on top of what exactly the lecturers were teaching for that given week. Now, as you can imagine, there were a lot of times that I was learning all of this extra information that was only in the third-party resources that was not actually being tested for me on those Friday quizzes. And then at the same time, and on the other hand, there was material that was being taught in those lectures that I was not getting but was not pertinent for the board exam. So I had to go ahead and make a sacrifice and decide, what would I rather have right now? Would I want the immediate satisfaction of doing the best that I could do on this weekly quiz, or would I want the long-term satisfaction of taking the board exam more quickly and more confidently? Especially in light of the quiz results that I was getting on a weekly basis that weren't anything to write home about, I knew that I had made this trade in advance, which really helped because I knew that I was actually preparing myself for something that would pay off for me but would take longer. So literally the way that you can think about this is to go ahead and try unlearning something that you've been taught for the past 20 years. Now, what do I mean by that? Every single person that is in medical school right now has done very well academically, or has at least taken enough gap years and time to prove themselves that they are dedicated academically. Now, what that often requires, and this is from the public education system at least that I went through and from the undergraduate college that I went to, is that grades are the lead performance indicator of whether or not a student is high achieving or not. Now, the medical school will ascribe us grades based on how we do in class. So if I were to say that board exams are now my priority over the lecture content exams, I'm now requiring myself to unlearn the fact that my key performance indicator on on how well I'm actually doing in my academic preparation is now not determined by a score that I get on a weekly basis and what my classmates tell me their score was. What I have to remember now is that I've unlearned all of that, and I am now preparing for a test exam score that will not come until over a year from now. So as you can imagine, this is very closely tied with ego, because as we all know, it feels great to have immediate feedback, or at least very short-term feedback on how well you're doing. In this case, getting those weekly quizzes back with, a really high grade versus waiting a long time and actually not even being neutral on it, but feeling bad about the quiz scores that you're getting because you think that all of the work that you're putting in, which is arguably, equal to or more than what other students are doing, is not giving you any results at all. And also a personal belief of mine is that work ethic is directly tied to the amount of time that you can go before receiving positive reinforcement from doing something over and over again. So as you can imagine, to go ahead and spoil the story, 9 months later, when our class finally took our practice step 1 exam, I finally got the feedback that I was looking for, and I knew that it was all worthwhile and that I had set myself up for success. So to break it down even further, my school is divided into 5 blocks, and actually, like I said, in terms of making these mistakes myself, I spent the first 2 of those 5 blocks not really knowing what any of this academic integrity stuff was, not thinking about my exam preparation, and then the later 3 blocks are the ones that I really started locking in, and I'll explain the difference between those 2. So even though I had decided actually before those first 2 of the 5 blocks that I was going to be dedicating most of my time to step 1 exam preparation instead of lecture exam preparation, this actually didn't play out optimally because it took me a while to figure out what that meant. So between my second and third blocks, I actually had a conversation with a mentor, and even though this wasn't said explicitly, this is when it all started to click for me. So what that actually involved was, in a time that I would normally be spending relaxing and hanging out with family a little bit more, I still did that, but for the most part, any downtime I had, I was going back through all of my cards, annotating them, adding any bit of extra content that I could, and asking myself, how far down the why chain can I get? Because I finally realized that after I had conversations with my friends that performed a lot better on these exams than I did, they could go much deeper into their logic and reasoning behind why they thought something was the way it was, much further than I had, because I let a bit of ego and my self-assessment wasn't as good as I thought it was. So as you can imagine, because this was a very fresh change, this honestly took me a while to get settled into, and as you can imagine, there was a lot of trial and error. Now, I would be lying if I also said that this wasn't going to take you a little bit of trial and error, because I think it will for everybody to figure out exactly how to dial it in for themselves. But for the most part, I think the strategy actually applies well broadly. Inevitably, in some classes, like for example, my Foundations of Medicine class, where I was learning genetics, I'm going to have to memorize gene mutations for diseases that I haven't actually learned yet, that I know I eventually will, and it's hard to make an argument for how far down the why chain I should go when I haven't even learned about what a disease is. So there are times that you need to memorize things, and you will just have to use your own intuition to decide how far down you go. But for the most part, especially by the time you get to the end of your exam preparation, if that's where you are right now, is when you finally integrated and at least have covered on a surface level what all of the information is. That's when you want to start to be able to make as many ties as you can from each piece of information to the rest of your web of knowledge. All of this really got me back on track and set me in a good place mentally, and I applied this for the rest of the 3 blocks that I had. The second subcomponent I have from my own personal experience was the importance of prioritizing your review material and the things that you've already learned over the new material that you're going to be learning for a given week. And this does sound counterintuitive, but let me explain. This especially gets more important as time goes by. So let's say arbitrarily that in your given medical school, you have 50 weeks exactly of lecture content that's going to be given to you of study material before you go into step 1. So for my analogy, which I think is pretty good for this topic, think of each of those 50 weeks as a seed, and that each time you learn the content and get to the end of that week, what you should have done to that seed is watered it and turned it into a beautiful flower, so that by the time you go into step 1, you now have a garden of 50 nice flowers and you're confident to take the exam. Now let's talk about strategy. So for the first week, week 1, obviously the optimal strategy is just going to be to learn the content, aka water your seed and have it grow into a flower. Now, what I see so many people forgetting is the importance of, once you get to week 2, and especially it gets more important as time goes by, is that are you going back to all the flowers that you have watered and giving them a little bit more water each and every day? Because the natural progression of those flowers is they're going to die. So you might think that sounds pretty obvious, but why do so many people not do it? And I can give you the counterpoint here, which is that what medical students actually think is that they see their calendar a year out, and they see that they have a step 1 exam study block, which is several months long, and they think, how is it that I can maximize my grades? Again, going back to the ego of figuring out, how do I get the most short-term reward, aka the most reinforcement of that I'm doing well and I'm learning correctly at the end of each week, is going to be, how do I maximize my weekly quiz score? Now, the way to do that would be to spend the most amount of time possible on that weekly quiz score, but again, they have to come up with a decision on how they're going to treat all of those flowers that they previously grew. And so their thought process behind this is that because they have that step 1 exam study period at the end, they're going to do as well as they can and spend as close to 100% of the time for any given week that they have focusing on that week's content solely. And then at the end, in that step 1 exam study period, is when they will finally go back and water all of the flowers, and all of the information will magically come back to them just as pristine and optimally and as beautifully the flower could be, when in reality what happens is they come back to a graveyard of dead flowers, and what they actually have to do is grab another seed, it's the same seed still, and plant it right where that flower was and wait for it to grow all the way up again, which is why people end up taking all the way until January to do that step 1 study period. Whereas if they had have spent a little bit of time each week going back and watering those flowers, and they might not have done as well on each quiz, they still would have ended up in a better place and saving themselves so much time and so much pain. So something that's really funny, but is actually how this strategy plays out if it's done correctly, is that by the time you get to the 49th flower or the 49th week of material, what you're actually doing is spending about 95% of your time, which is your whole morning and afternoon and evening in my case, doing all of your review content, which is watering all of those other 48 flowers that are so pretty and ready to be integrated into a step 1 exam strategy, because those are just more valuable places to spend your time. Now you might be asking, what about that content itself? And yes, you are going to be spending your, again, nights in this case. It ramps up as you get closer to exam time, so you're going to be spending more and more time studying, but you spend that extra bit of time picking up the exam's content. In my case, it was really nice because our medical school actually made our last few weeks of content much lighter than they were at the beginning of the year, so that we could slowly progress into an exam ready state. And I will preach this lesson until I'm blue in the face, but it is just so important because it's a key piece of how you frame the exam and what you decide to do with your time. It can save you so much time, in my case months, if you do this the right way the first time. And my third and final sub point of my anecdotal experience in preparing for step 1 are the small changes that I made that helped. Just as a disclaimer, you don't need to do any of these things, but again, from my experience, they're what led me to quickly and confidently take step 1 in the first 1% of my class. As a quick disclaimer, again, you shouldn't feel pressured that you need to do any of the things that I'm recommending here. They're just simply keys that helped me move more quickly and confidently into passing step 1. Firstly, you should be studying on a select few resources when you're studying and preparing for the exam, with the majority of what you're doing with your time. Now, I like to think of step 1, again, in this case, as the top of a mountain. There are a bunch of different paths that you can take up the mountain. So whether some people say that, you know, Pathoma is better than Sketchy, is better than Boards and Beyond, is better than reading the first aid book, or doing online flashcards versus going to lecture versus the book. The point is that you should stick with one strategy and not jump ship every time somebody tells you about how great their strategy is, because the fact that all of these strategies are around and all of these companies have made their money, it sounds crazy to say, but it showcases the fact that these are around for a reason, they're popular for a reason, and that if one exists, there's probably a student out there who close to maximize the score primarily using it. Now, there is one way to guarantee that you don't get to your goals, and that is to keep jumping between every single resource and never stick to one, and keep relearning the same content in a bunch of different formats, and decide to go to lecture one week, but then decide to read the textbook the next week, and then decide to do third party the next. The point is that you should stick to a consistent strategy so that you're actually able to get active feedback from the thing that you're studying, instead of not ever knowing what works and what doesn't. This is how you trial and error. You can't trial and error if you don't fully trial something. So for me, what you might be able to tell is that I primarily used Anki, which is a flashcard resource that most medical students actually use, and I supplemented that with first aid. So I would upload screenshots and I would read the first aid book as I was moving through Anki. Now, outside of that, there were a couple videos that I watched, and those were Boards and Beyond, Sketchy, and Pathoma. But outside of that, and I'm not talking about practice exam questions here, those are really all the resources I used. I wasn't going to be bothered every time one of my close friends said that their resource worked really well for them. I would just say, that's great, I'm sticking with these, and I'm going to know that this works confidently because that's my strategy and that's the ecosystem that I'm going to be working with. That's it. In my opinion, it wouldn't have sped up my exam taking process any faster if I had to jump between a bunch of resources or decided that I was going to get shiny object syndrome and say, wow, that one looks really cool, or somebody told me about that one, I really want to give it a try. Try to decide these things as early on as you can and then stick with them and be consistent. That's the fastest path up the mountain to stick to one. In other words, it pays to be committed to something. And if it's something y'all want me to make videos about in the future, definitely stay tuned and I can talk about my exact study strategy and more nuanced things about what I was doing. But for the most part, I want this video to be about the overall perspective of taking the exam. So in conclusion, let me go ahead and re-emphasize some of the key points that we went over here today that I don't want you to forget. Number one, step one being pass-fail doesn't lower the ceiling, it just prolongs the time until you see it. Number two, build a strong foundation with academic integrity early on for step one so that your step two actually has room to climb. Number three, water your flowers daily, consistently review that material. Number four, choose a few great resources and stick with them, be consistent. Number five, do it right the first time, and with those key points, your future self will thank you. With that said, if you want more med school insight videos, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.